Yeshua, Sophie, Yeshua, Charlotte, you brought us two really interesting questions this morning. One was about the process of moving toward freedom or any kind of big transition and what emerges in us in a fear of the unknown. What happens to us when we're moving from the known to the unknown, whether that's walking across the sea to freedom or whether that's coming through a pandemic? What happens to us in that panic and fear of what's unknown? And then the idea of, even in the most dramatic story of enslavers and enslaved, of oppressors and oppressed, should we really see it as black and white? Are there really just good guys and bad guys? And even if we do think generally there are good guys and bad guys sometimes, is it okay for the bad guys to die? Is that ever something we would ever rejoice over? We noted, Sophie, that God says no. No, we don't rejoice, even over the deaths of the people who've been the oppressor. And perhaps in more generally, we need to see it less as black and white and see the humanity and have compassion and try to seek understanding about the people who've been in the role of the oppressor. I want to connect all of that to where we are right now, in our own place, in our own time. This particular weekend especially. Because here we are on Martin Luther King weekend, and I want to connect your words to this moment. So there's an interesting passage that happens right before the people cross the sea, where the people cry, Pharaoh's army's coming, bearing down on the people. They're standing wedged between the sea and the army, and they become afraid. And they cry out to God. And then immediately after crying out to God, they do what you talked about, Sophie, they complain. And they say to Moses, was it because there weren't enough graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die here? And then what happens next is that God says to Moses, why are you, Moses, crying out to me? Tell the people to go forward into the sea. So the commentators are confused because Moses didn't actually cry out. Why is God saying to Moses, why did you cry out? And what is the crying out that's being referred to, and what exactly is going on here? And Ramban, Nachmanides, a Spanish rabbi of the 13th century, says that actually what might be happening here in this complicated set of events is that Moses does actually cry out to God, and Moses' cry is not the same as the cry of the people. That when the people cry out, they're crying out in fear. They then get into conspiracy thinking because they're so panicked. And they think, well, wait a second, Pharaoh's coming now. And we thought that God had liberated us. But then Pharaoh wouldn't be coming if God had liberated us. So this must all be a mistake. Maybe God was just punishing the Egyptians, and God actually was never about our freedom, just about punishing the Egyptians. And maybe Moses took us out of Egypt to become our ruler instead of Pharaoh. And their fear got them thinking in all kinds of convoluted ways about what was happening, and they started to have conspiracy theories. Now, we can certainly relate to that in our own society today, where people are afraid about the unknown, the many unknowns of our time. Right? I could list them out, there's so many. Pandemic, climate change, global migration, and changing demographics in this country. Right? And so there's lots of panic and there's lots of conspiracy theories happening. And so Moses, Ramban is saying, what God is responding to is Moses saying to God, these people are out of control. They're actually making things up right now, and they might not even listen to me when I tell them to cross the sea. What am I supposed to do with these people? And what God says to Moses, Sforno, another medieval commentator says, what God says to Moses is, don't doubt them. You think that they're just being rebellious and sarcastic and so out of control. Actually, they're just afraid. They're just afraid. Tell them it's okay to go forward. And Moses says back to them, don't be afraid. And then Moses lifts up his arm and the sea splits and the people walk forward. And I hear this passage very much speaking to what you're talking about and also this moment. The way that when we're afraid, we panic and often are not our best selves. And the way that we ought to have faith in people even when they're afraid. Teach them to calm down and teach them to move forward. So how does that all connect to this moment? Well, here we are. It's Martin Luther King weekend. And The big debate in Washington is whether people should have the right to vote in America. It's kind of amazing that that's the conversation that we're having. Why are we having that conversation? Because there are a lot of people in this country who are afraid. They're really afraid that things are changing in a way that they're going to lose their power. And this brings us to, Sophie, your call that we should try to understand the people who we might think are on the wrong side of history. Right? The Egyptians were on the wrong side of history in this story, right? And here we have, in our country, people who are saying we shouldn't teach about the history of slavery and racism in this country. We shouldn't allow it being taught in the schools. People saying we shouldn't allow people to be able to vote because, well, there's this conspiracy theory that there's all this voter fraud, which is just not true. And there's the thought that an election was stolen, which we know it was just not true. And so it's clear people are afraid. Now, having compassion for the Egyptians in this story doesn't mean that the Israelites shouldn't become free. Of course the Israelites have to become free. Of course slavery has to end. And actually, the liberation process isn't only for the Israelites, it's also for the Egyptians. Because it is a trap to be in the position of the oppressor. It's actually not healthy and whole to be in the position of the oppressor. And when liberation happens and the oppressed go free, that's actually good for the oppressors as well. But they're panicked and they're afraid in our moment. What is it going to look like to lose power? What is it going to look like to share power? Am I going to then be treated the way that we've been treating Black people in this country all this time? Am I going to be subject to violence? Am I going to lose what I have? Is my humanity not going to be held in its full beauty and significance? Am I going to be dehumanized in the ways that Black people have been dehumanized in this country? So we see white people, not all, but some white people in this country, maybe many, afraid. And we need to, in this moment, have compassion for that experience of the unknown. Because our country is changing. It's going to be a majority of people of color. And that's terrifying for white people who've held the reins of power all this time. And it's underneath all of the events we see happening in our time right now in our country. And so, we have to have compassion for that experience, not just demonize and wish the downfall, but soften to that fear. Dr. King said, famously, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." Now, loving and having compassion for people who are being hateful doesn't mean we give permission for hate, doesn't mean we give permission for voter suppression, doesn't mean we give permission for violence, doesn't mean we give permission for racism, doesn't mean any of that. It just means we don't hate or make them the enemy. And we keep crossing the sea. Now, that's the idea, is that we're still crossing the sea, right? The Emancipation Proclamation might have been in 1863, but the process of liberation is not over in this country. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act might have been many, many years ago, but we still don't have equal and civil rights in this country. The Voting Rights Act might have been in 1965, but obviously we still don't have universal guarantee of voting rights. We are still crossing the sea. We don't slow down one bit, we keep crossing. We don't compromise on any of those principles one bit, we keep crossing. We keep crossing. But while we cross, and the Egyptians are drowning, we don't rejoice. We don't turn the tables. We have compassion for the Egyptians. By the way, in many cases, it's us in this story. Right? We have compassion for the ones with power, for the fear of what's the unknown, what's coming next, what's the wilderness going to be like? Am I still going to be okay? Is my family going to be okay? Are my children going to be okay? Is there going to be safety for me? Am I going to have what I need? We have compassion for all of those fears as we keep walking across the sea. So this particular weekend, Dr. King's family has asked everyone, if you're going to celebrate Dr. King's memory, you have got to stand up for voting rights this weekend. Congress is debating it this weekend. And we just happen in this congregation to count the Senate Majority Leader as one of our members. Senator Chuck Schumer is a member of this congregation. And so the way that we as a congregation are going to be standing up for voting rights this weekend is we're writing him a letter as a community saying, we know that you are dedicated to voting rights. You have made it clear. We see you fighting for it. We have your back. As the people who sit next to you here on High Holy Days, as the people who are your neighbors and your friends, we are with you. We believe in you. Keep fighting. We have your back. Now that letter came out to the membership, I think yesterday or the day before. We're going to send it to him tonight after Shabbat. If you have a chance before 8 o'clock to get on that link and put your name on there, we've already got hundreds and hundreds of our members signed the letter. It's going to go to him tonight to just give him that extra feeling of push from us, saying we are with you. Because we are still crossing that sea. We have not arrived. We're not even close to having arrived. We are crossing that sea. And the last thing I'll say, because I just called us the Egyptians, and that may be upsetting for people, I just want to say, the people who crossed the sea were not just Israelites. You might not know this, but it was a mixed multitude. It was a whole mix of people, including some Egyptians, crossed the sea with them. People held hands across their differences, and they marched because they were invested in freedom. And they knew they had to march. They couldn't just be passive. They had to actually march to get to the other side. We are still crossing the sea.